Welcome back to part 6 of our series where we are exploring the world of Azure SQL databases using Python and then just exploring different concepts and ideas that are important to know when it comes to utilizing this particular service. So in our previous video, we have seen how to connect to an Azure SQL database using PyODBC. We've also seen how to connect to it using SQL Server Management Studio and Azure Data Studio. What we're now going to talk about next is how we can manage at least our databases and servers using the Azure SQL Management Package that is part of the Azure SDK library. Now, I want to be very clear with this particular package. You can't really execute SQL queries or anything like that. You could only do things like get a list of the servers that you currently have associated with your account. You could create a new server. You could create a new database. You could update a database. So if you want to change certain features or something like that, you could do that as well. But when it comes to actually like inserting records or things like that, it's not really intended to do that, at least at this stage. I'm hoping at some point that maybe that will change, but as of right now, that's not a feature that is part of the package. So there's a couple things that we're going to have to do in order to use this particular package. If you've been watching other videos, you at least know that the Azure SDK is a relatively large library, and there's certain packages that you need to have installed at least by default in order to use some of the other core packages. But in this particular video, I do have a list of what I would say are at least the bare minimum requirements that you should have. I try to comment out the ones that I don't think are important at this stage. However, we will uncomment one of those right now, which is the Azure Management SQL package. I'm currently showing you the 0.20 version. I guess that's how I should call it. But there are constantly pushing out updates and stuff like that. So just be aware. I think, see, now they're on version 0.21. So technically, if I wanted to, I should update this one as well. Now, if you want to take this requirement file and actually run it yourself, then what you would need to do is clone the repo, and then from Visual Studio Code or from your command prompt, you could do pip install r and then requirements.txt. And then it's going to run through it. You can see here it's uninstalling my old version and now pushing me to the latest one as well. So different ways you could also do, if you want to install just that specific package, you could do pip install Azure SQL Management. So just like that, or sorry, Azure Management SQL. Something just like that. You can see it would do it the same exact way. You just have to be careful because if you install just this one, this might depend on other ones. And then if that doesn't get installed or you don't have the right version, you might not technically be able to use it. So I found, if you just take the requirement file, you're usually good to go. Also, if you want to see the actual, source code behind it or something like that, you can do Azure Management SQL as well. You can see, if you click basically on the first link, you can see the different methods and stuff like that. So you can see that there's database operations, elastic pools operations. We're not going to go through every single one, obviously, just because there's a ton, but generally they all function the same. And once you kind of do 2 or 3, you tend to find out that they're almost all identical. It's just kind of changing certain names here and there, but the operations tend to be exactly the same. Okay, perfect. So let's start doing the actual writing of the code. The first one we're going to import is prettyprint. We're going to be importing and printing out some stuff. So it's just going to be nice if we had that all lined out for us. And then additionally, I do have a config file set up. Now, if you were watching the other videos, you don't technically need to do this. If you set up your environment correctly, you should be able to use the default Azure credentials as well. I would highly recommend you use this way, but just again, for diversity purposes and showing you different ways to do similar things, in this particular video, I'm going to show you loading it from a config file. Then from here, we're going to do from azure.management.sql, import the SQL management client. Notice that there were two options. You have a client and then you have a client configuration. So this is just more for the actual configuration aspects. This is more for doing things like getting your databases and stuff like that. So you can actually run different things. Now, the one thing I do want to let you know is a lot of this is auto-generated code. So it might be a little bit hard to read sometimes, or it might not necessarily look super pretty, but it tends to follow some type of flow. So as much as it might not be super explicit sometimes, a lot of times it's not too bad. Okay, and then from here, we're going to import from the Azure common.credentials package. We're going to import the service principals credentials. So remember how we created a service principal? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create an instance of that object per se. We're going to pass through our configuration values. So our things like our tenant ID and our client ID and all sorts of fun stuff like that. And we're going to connect to our database using that particular method as well. So this is just an easier way to do those operations as well. Now, additionally, if you want to leverage IntelliSense inside of your code, well, we can do that, but we're going to have to make our lives a little bit easier, which means we're going to have to import certain objects that if we don't, then we're not going to be able to see all the methods and properties for those particular objects that we're going to be pulling. So these are simply for IntelliSense. Other than that, there's really no purpose of importing these ones. So we're going to say from Azure Management, SQL, there's a models package, and inside of there, you'll find the actual specific objects. In this case, we're going to be working with a server. We're going to be working with a database as well. So we're going to have a database. Now you can see here, there's obviously tons and tons of different objects in here as well. So some you're going to work with more than others. Other ones you're going to work with a lot. So I tend to find I work with these ones a ton. So that's what we're starting out with first. So we're going to initialize the config parser. This we'll call config. We'll store in a variable called config, and then we'll do that. And then we're going to read our file. So config.read. And then it's going to be the config, because I have it in my config file or config folder. And inside of that folder, there's a config.ini file. So in that case, I want that one. So I want config.ini. And then from here, I can go to the next portion. So read the file. And then we're going to go a little bit further and we're going to grab the credentials. So grab the credentials. With a config file, you break it into sections, and then those sections have keys associated with them, and the keys are associated with a value. So in this case, I'm going to have a subscription ID. This will be config.get, and then it's going to be Azure credentials, and then it's going to be Azure subscription ID. And then really, I'm just going to be repeating this line a few times. No, I don't want that little note. And then we're going to do this and then this. And here we go. Okay. Azure tenant ID. And we'll call this our tenant ID. We'll call this our client ID. And then finally, we'll have our client secret. And then we'll call this our Azure client ID. And then we'll have our Azure client secrets. Perfect. And then what's going on? What's wrong? What's the issue? Oh no. I don't know why it's freaking out. Oh, it's because I didn't specify the actual object itself. See, every time it pops up like that, I'm like, wait a minute, something's going wrong. Okay, and then from here, we're going to define our service principal. So define our service principal. And then so what you do is you normally call this credentials. And then it's going to be the service principals, credentials. And then from here, there's keyword arguments. So the first one is going to be our tenant. This is going to be our tenant ID. We have a client ID. That's going to be our client ID. And then we're going to have a secret. That is our client secret. And there you go. That's basically how you would use it. If you didn't have your environment set up, you would just create an instance of your service principals credentials object. You would pass through your tenant, your client, and then your client secret. And then from here, you would then go into the next portion, which is actually specifying your management client. So this is a very common pattern you're going to see if you don't set up your environment. Is you specify your credentials. You then create your management client after you've created your credentials. And so from here, initialize the SQL management client, and then we'll say SQL management client equals SQL management client brackets credentials equals the credentials you defined up above. And then you're going to specify your subscription ID because you're going to be tied to your subscription. Then it's going to be your subscription ID. This will create a new instance of your SQL management client. From here, I like to tend to just print it out really quickly. And then I can see different things with it. So I can say, oh, I don't know, database usage, database, it's all over the page. Okay, databases, right? So you could get your databases and stuff like that. Let's just do this. Let's actually grab our servers first. So grab the servers inside of our subscription. So we'll call this server. If you want to grab all of them, you could say for server inside of SQL management client, and then it would be servers. And then you would say get, or is it just servers? Maybe it's just servers. Let's try this one. And then from here, what I tend to do is I'll use IntelliSense at this point and I'll reassign it, because otherwise you'll get something like this. Oh, well, that time it worked. Oh, that's interesting. Well, we'll see what happens. What's happening here? Is this the one list? That's what you need to do. So you list each one and then you print it. And then so now this is going to be interesting, because now I want to see, oh no, it still does it. Okay, that's fine. Maybe it was fixed. Maybe I was doing something wrong last time. Who knows? So let's see what happens and see if we can at least do something simple. Azure credentials. Is there something wrong? Sorry about that. I realized that when I had done this line, I was being foolish and I had an equal sign there. You don't need an equal sign there. You don't need an equal sign at all. So, and then of course I did the whole full path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back to my little shorthanded path. Should work now. I tested it. Hopefully we're good. So yeah, all we're doing is we're going to list out each server. So if we run it, we should be able to see everything here. Okay, perfect. So that looks good. I'm happy that we can see that now. Now I do want to show you some things that can be a little bit challenging when people first use it. So naturally they go, oh, if I can print it, can I use pretty print too? Because it looks like a dictionary, right? Oh, sadly, no. So this is where things can get a little bit confusing. What you need to do is you need to do as dictionary. And so when you do as dictionary, this actually converts it to like an actual dictionary object that you can then print out in a more readable fashion. And then additionally, you can now notice that you can actually go through everything. Now, this is if you wanted to print everybody. This is if you wanted to get every single server and you wanted to look at every single server. Now, once you have a server, you can get additional information. So you can get the ID. You could say, hey, I want to get the administrator login password, all sorts of different stuff. You can get the name. You could get the, fully qualified domain name. There's lots of different stuff you could get from this once you start pulling everything in here. So this is actually helpful when we actually use our PyODBC library, because what it allows us to do is we could grab our information using the SQL Management Client, take the information from there if we wanted to, and then use it with our PyODBC library. So most of the things, though, you're going to notice are just some properties, and they just tell different things about it. So if I wanted to see my version, for example, I could see that. If I wanted to see, I don't know, my identity, the location of it, you could see that as well. You could see tags, is XML model. I don't know what that's for. Maybe it's something different. But this is generally the pattern you'll see when you're using a SQL management client. Is it allows you to grab those resources, and then you can print out the properties of those resources and even do operations sometimes. So say, for example, I wanted to create a new server, right? I could say servers, and then you'll notice I can do operations like create or update. I could do delete. I could do get, list resource group. I could do update. So I could check and see if the name is available. All sorts of different things that you can do with it. Now, I'm not going to create a new server just because that's a little bit of a time-consuming process, but you could technically do different operations here. We will do, I think I have one very simple example where I show you how to create a database, but we're not going to do anything crazy complicated at this point. Now, additionally, if you wanted to grab, say, a specific server, you can do that as well. You don't have to grab everything and then loop through each one of them. You could actually do a different method. So what you could do is grab a specific server. So we'll call this server equals, and then I'm just going to use this for type hinting. It seems to not be an issue now, but I don't trust it. And then we're going to do servers get. And then from here, you specify your resource group. So for example, I could say my resource group name is Sigma Coding Tutorial. So that's the resource group that contains it. And then I need to specify my server name. Now, in this situation, there's a couple of different things I could use. I could just say, hey, I want to grab my Sigma Coding Tutorials. And then I could put that here as well. And then that's one way of doing it. And then I could see what happens when I do that. Okay, so that looks fine. That looks like everything was working and that there were no issues behind it. So that's always encouraged. And you can notice here that it does allow me to get certain information like the login and stuff like that, fully qualified name. Doesn't have the password in here, thank God. That would scare me to death that they would just print that out. But you can at least get some information as well. And then if you wanted to, you could even go down to the next level, right? Because we know a server contains databases. So grab a database in our server. So from here, I'm going to create a new variable, call it database. I'm going to use type hinting as well. We'll do SQL Management Client. In this situation, I'm going to do the databases property, and then I'm going to do the get property as well. Follows a very similar pattern. You would specify your resource group, and you would do your server name. In this case, it would be Sigma Coding Tutorials. And then next, you need to specify your database name. Now, by default, you could get the master database. A lot of times we don't want to work with that one. We want to work with a more specific database. The other thing I will warn you is so say, for example, you were going to loop through all your databases, and then you're just going to assume that the first database that comes back to you is the only database. So I was ignorant and I thought, oh, I just need to grab the first one, right? The first one's always going to be the master. So a lot of times you'll think, oh, I only have that one database in there, right? No, you have a master database and then you have your database. So a lot of times what happens is, if you were like me, you started looping through it, you just assumed that the first one that was being sent back was your database, which it wasn't. It was the master database. And then all of a sudden your connections wouldn't work. And you're like, what's going on? Like, I've tested my connection strings before and I've never had issues. What's the problem? It's more than likely that you're using your master database as your connection. That's very different, because if you have your queries set up where it's going to insert into certain tables, that table more than likely doesn't exist in your master database. So just a little bit of a warning for all of you, because like I said, I did it, and half of this channel is just letting you know all the mistakes I've done, because it's quite hilarious, the things I've done over these years. Okay, perfect. So now we were able to get our database. So you can see everything's here. You could see all the different stuff. You can see your SKUs, the technology, if it's online or not, that's important. The type. You can see the max log size, location, all sorts of different stuff. And then just like the previous one, you could do more specific items. You don't have to print everything out. You could say, hey, I just want my ID. Hey, I just want my name. It's just very basic pieces of information. You don't have to grab everything. Okay, so now that we've done that, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to create a database using the SQL Management Client. Again, I wouldn't recommend you do this unless you want an actual database created for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to say operation result equals SQL Management Client, databases, create or update. Oh yes, resource group name. I'm just going to copy this because this is literally the same stuff that I'm putting in the other one. So it's kind of repetitive to type that all out again. But the important part is, if you wanted to do a very bare bones basic, nothing specified, nothing fancy, nothing crazy at all, then all you would do is you would specify that database name. Because our server is set up, there's a lot that's assumed behind the scenes for you. And we'll call this financial news test. And then that's our database. And then we have our parameters. Now, I'm only putting in one parameter. Technically, there's a lot of other stuff you might want to specify, but just for a very basic version of showing you how it works, all I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the location. Okay. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the operation result. And then I'm going to call that result. So this returns an LRO polar. No idea what that means exactly. Azure Operation Polar. Why don't they just call it that? Okay. And then from here, we can print out the result. So let's see what this does for us. And then once it does its operation, I want to see what happens inside of Azure Portal. So let's see if that database does pop up. It does take a few seconds, so don't expect, again, anything super fast, like, oh, it's going to be created instantly. It does take a few seconds to do all the operations necessary. So if you're impatient, this might not be the particular package for you. It's actually really quick for the most part compared to most other things I think I've done in the past. I think it's neat that you can create all this stuff in like 5 seconds. But while that's running, I will also start writing the second portion of the code, which is deleting an existing database. And then you can tell here that it finished. So we'll call this one operation result as well. SQL Management Client, databases, delete. And then from here, I'm literally going to just take this information because that's all you have to provide. Just like that, you are good to do that. Now, you can see it provides a lot of different stuff in here. So a couple things. Hey, GP Gen 5 2. I might not necessarily want that, but here it is. It's a little bit easier to see everything inside of the SQL server. You can see here's that wonderful little database. General purpose Gen 5. Keep in mind, this is not serverless. Ooh, that's expensive, right? Because that can get really expensive. But we're going to be deleting it really quickly. So it's not an issue at this point. But you can tell here, one of the things is if you go down to properties sorry about that. My computer just totally shut off on me when I was recording. Why? I don't know. That kind of scared me a little bit, but it is what it is. What we were talking about was we had just created our database. And so now we're looking at it inside of the Azure portal. And, now that we've created it, you can see it here and all this kind of fun stuff. So if you go down to your properties section inside of the settings, you can see all the information that was specified when we created it. So very simple. Again, nothing too crazy at this point. We did a very, very basic operation. So now that we've created that database, what if we want to delete it? Well, we've already seen that the code's right here for us. So let's just run through that operation. And hopefully no issues, right? So just like the previous operation, they're not outrageously quick in like 2 seconds, but they're relatively quick. So you just have to make sure it has enough time to execute the operation that you're specifying. So there you can see nothing is returned because it was just deleting it. What I want to do from here is I want to go back. Where is it? I will refresh it. You can now see it's no longer there. So if I go into here, hopefully this is the only one I have left now. And then there you go. So that would be deleting deleting a database. So you can now create or update. You can delete. You can grab databases. You can grab servers. You can grab properties from those particular servers and stuff like that. And we'll see more operations with this as we go into different topics. But at this point, I think this is enough for this particular video. And then personally, I don't want to continue if this thing is already starting to shut down on me. But if you have any questions about using the Azure SQL Management Package, by all means, put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, in our next video, I think we're going to move on to our next resource, which is the Cosmos database. So the Cosmos database is a document database, and this is for not basically data that's not structured or not well structured and might be changing all the time. And we'll talk more about that particular database and how it relates to relational databases and things like that. But document databases are very popular, things like MongoDB and stuff like that. They're used all over the place. So definitely worth our time to start exploring that particular topic and seeing how we can leverage it in our code and seeing how we can use it as a place for storage when we're pulling data from things like APIs or things like that, where again, the data might not be necessarily super structured or might be constantly changing and we need a little bit more flexibility. But yes, that's basically what we have covered next. And I think after that, we would probably go at least start talking about data factories a little bit. We might talk about Azure functions before that, but we'll have to see. So that's kind of the fun thing about Azure. There's so many things we can talk into. But other than that, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.